She spent 9 days arranging every candle, every seat, every silence, so the ceremony would go flawlessly. She was the woman who fixed what no one else could see, the one who stood in the second row, because that was where the invisible belonged. He was the Alpha King of Ironmore, powerful, unreadable. And once, just once, in a dark forest with an arrow in his shoulder, he had looked at her like she was the only thing worth seeing. Then came the oath renewal. 43 lords watched as he walked to the dais. His gaze swept the hall, touched her, and kept moving. He placed his hand on someone else's shoulder. She did not flinch. She did not shatter. She simply placed her hand over her heart, inclined her head, and walked out the door. Why did the man who once begged her to stay choose, in front of everyone, to let her disappear? Watch until the end, because this story is far more than it seems. The arrow had gone in at an angle. Ilara Voss noticed this first. Not the man, not the blood darkening his sleeve to near black in the fading light, but the angle, the way the fletching tilted wrong against his shoulder. The shaft had turned inside the wound. Removing it would not be simple. She set down her gathering basket, knelt. "Right hand or left?" she asked. He opened his eyes. They were dark, the charcoal gray of river stones in deep water, and there was a quality to them she recognized from years of practice, the look of a man who had decided he would not show how much this hurt, and was using considerable effort to keep that decision. "What?" His voice came out rough-edged, stripped of whatever authority it normally carried. "Which hand do you favor, right or left?" She was already pressing 2 fingers below the entry wound, mapping the shape of what she couldn't see. "I need to know before I give you the counteragent. Affects the dominant arm differently." A pause. "Right. Good." She reached into her basket. "Hold still." He held still. She worked in the last of the daylight, and then by the small fire she built at the stream's edge. Her hands moving through tasks she had performed so many times, they had become a kind of language her body spoke without consulting her mind. He did not make a sound when she drew the arrow free. She felt the precise moment of it in the resistance, then the release. But the tendons in his neck rose like cables pulled taut, and his jaw set in a way that made the whole lower half of his face hard as carved stone. The fire threw warm light across his features. He was perhaps 27, 28. The kind of face that had been arranged by nature into something striking, and had then been further shaped by weather and decision into something more interesting than mere beauty. There was a quality of compression to him, as though a great deal had been pressed into a relatively composed exterior. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, as information. "You'll have a fever by midnight," she said, tying off the final stitch. "It won't kill you. It will be unpleasant. I've had fevers. I imagine you have." She looked at her work in the firelight. Clean. She had done cleaner in a palace surgery with 3 assistants, but this would hold. "You'll need to stay near the fire tonight. Can you walk?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Can you actually walk, or are you simply saying that?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "The second one," he admitted. "I thought so." She settled back on her heels and began sorting what remained in her basket. The forest had gone fully dark around them, the stream murmuring its indifferent business a few feet away. "You can stay here until morning. I'll check the wound at first light." He was quiet for a moment. She was aware of his gaze. It had a specific weight, deliberate, the way he looked at things as though deciding what they were worth before committing to an opinion. "You haven't asked who I am," he said. "People in pain are either who they claim to be or they aren't, and the difference rarely affects treatment." She found the jar of feverwort and opened it. "Drink this." "It's bitter." He drank it without complaint, did not make a face. "Your name," he said, when he handed back the empty cup. His tone had changed slightly. The roughness was still there, but authority was returning, quiet as a tide coming in. "What is it?" Alara began packing the used instruments. "You arrived after I did." A silence. Then, a low, unhurried laugh, barely more than an exhale. It had the quality of something that didn't happen often enough. He was watching her with those dark water eyes, and there was something in them that hadn't been there before the laugh. Something open, a warmth like coal catching under unexpected air. The firelight made his face do something complicated, and she became aware all at once of how small this clearing was, how close the fire drew everything together. She looked back at her basket. "Alara," she said. "Alara Voss." "Aldrich." "Just Aldrich, for tonight." "Sleep if you can," she said. "The fever will wake you." It did. Sometime past the middle of the night, his temperature climbed, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, and she sat beside him with a damp cloth and kept watch the way she had learned to keep watch, quietly, without making the patient feel observed. She had a talent for being present without intruding. At one point he said her name, not a question, not reaching for her, simply Alara, as though tasting whether the sound of it matched something. She pressed the cloth to his forehead and kept watch. By dawn, the fever had broken. By dawn, the hoofbeats of a dozen horses had reached the clearing, and Alara was standing at the tree line, refilling her water flask, when the riders appeared and swung down from their saddles, with the practiced efficiency of people trained to do many things without wasting motion, and then knelt. All of them, at once. To the man sitting with his back against an oak tree, his shoulder bandaged in strips of her spare linen, his hair disheveled from a night of fever, Alara watched the word form in the lead rider's mouth before she heard it. "Alpha King." The flask stopped filling. She turned slowly. Aldrich had risen. He moved differently upright, the compression she'd sensed in him expanding into something that occupied space with the natural authority of a thing that had always occupied exactly this much space and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. His eyes found her across the clearing. He had the expression of a man preparing to explain something he'd chosen, knowingly, not to explain sooner. She held his gaze. Let the silence do what words would fumble. Then she picked up her basket, checked the clasp on the medicine bag, began to stand. "Stay." The word crossed the clearing without effort, not raised, not commanding in the way of a shout. It carried the particular quality of something said from the chest, from the place where a person keeps what they actually mean. Not an order. Too close to something else for comfort. The riders glanced between them. Alara stood, adjusted the strap of her basket, looked at him for a moment longer than she had intended to, finding his face in the early morning light, the fever gone, the controlled lines returned, but underneath them something that hadn't been there before the night. Something she had no good word for. "Next time," she said, "the person who arrives second introduces themselves first." She walked into the forest. She did not look back. She told herself the warmth in her sternum was the exertion of the walk home. It was a convincing argument for approximately 3 days. The candles in the great hall were the wrong color. Alara noticed this at dawn, while the kitchen staff were still laying the tables, before anyone of consequence had arrived to form opinions about anything. White candles. She had specified gold, had written it down, had submitted the request to the head steward 6 days in advance. White was the color of winter mourning in the Harwin tradition, and Duck Harwin of the western border would be seated in the 3rd row with his wife and 2 advisors. She had the white candles replaced by 7:30. She had also, the night before, reseated Count Rael of the Eastern Lands and the Duck to opposite sides of the hall. They would not share a sightline for the duration of the ceremony. This was not a decision she announced. It appeared as a natural result of the seating arrangements, which appeared as a natural result of the hall's geometry, which appeared to have always been thus. The morning wore on. She moved through the preparations with the particular efficiency of someone who had performed a complex task so many times, it had become atmospheric. Present everywhere, visible nowhere. At one point, Dame Isolde found her in the corridor outside the medical storeroom, inventorying herb packets. "You've been awake since before the bells," Isolde said.
There was a great deal to arrange. The old woman was quiet for a moment, watching her with those careful eyes.
Isolde, who had been grand consort to the previous king, who had watched things happen at this court for 30 years and had learned to identify patterns the way other people identified weather. "The ceremony will go smoothly," Isolde said. "It will," Alara agreed, "because I spent 9 days making sure of it." The great hall filled in the way of all such occasions, gradually and then all at once. Noise and color and the particular smell of too many important people in one space, wearing their best wool. Alara entered through the side door. She carried nothing. She needed nothing. Everything she had prepared was already in its place. She found her position, not at the front, not at Aldrich's side on the dais, but in the second row of standing observers, slightly left of center. From here she could see the dais clearly, could see the positioning of the lamp she'd had adjusted yesterday, could see Duck Harwin 3 rows ahead and Count Rael 4 rows to the right, separated by half a hall and the weight of her careful management. A man she didn't recognize was standing alone near the north pillar. She would not have given him more than a passing glance, except that he was the only person in the room, watching the room, rather than the dais, tracking movement, taking inventory. He had the patient posture of someone accustomed to gathering information in public spaces without appearing to. Silver-gray eyes. Dressed well, but without the ostentatious sigils of any court she recognized. His gaze reached her, passed on, then returned. Noted, she thought, and looked away. The ceremony began. She knew the order, the lesser lords first, by territory, east to west. The senior council after, and then, at the ceremony's heart, the moment when the Alpha King acknowledged his bond before the assembled lords. The placing of hands, the formal recognition, the words spoken aloud that made the bond a matter of record rather than merely a feeling. The moment when he would call her forward. She had not let herself think about this directly. She was good at not thinking about things directly, at approaching them from the sides, examining them in peripheral vision. She had rehearsed the walk from the second row to the dais in her mind, until it was a series of steps rather than a statement. Aldrich ascended the dais. He was impossible to overlook in any room, but in this room, in this light, the effect was more pointed. He was tall the way certain things were tall, not simply in measurement, but in how he occupied vertical space, how the room reorganized itself around him without being told to. He wore Ironmore's colors and the gold of his rank, and his dark hair was pushed back from his face in the way that meant he had been doing something with his hands not long before, and hadn't thought to address it. The angle of his jaw was exactly as she remembered from a clearing 3 years ago in the first light of morning. She stood in the second row. She waited. He looked out across the assembled lords. His gaze moved. She tracked it the way she tracked a wound, watching for what it would do next. Swept left, swept right, touched her, kept moving. Her breath held itself, careful and contained, while he turned to his right. He placed his hand on the shoulder of Lady Vane Ashcroft. The silence that followed was not the silence of scandal. It was quieter than that. A private silence, the kind that forms in the space between what was expected and what occurred, while everyone in the room decided simultaneously whether they had seen what they had seen. Ilara had not let herself move. She was very good at not moving. 43 lords stood in this hall. She was aware of a number of them looking at her now, not openly, the way people look at spectacle, but in that careful sideways manner that means we are all deciding how to not acknowledge what just happened. Across the hall, the silver-eyed man from the north pillar was looking at her directly, not sideways, not with the careful calculation of a court observer. He simply looked at her, with the frank attention of someone who had decided, a moment ago, that she was worth looking at. Something resolved in her chest. Not breaking, more like a lock clicking open, releasing a door she had not known she'd been holding shut. She placed her hand over her heart, the traditional mark of witness and respect, and inclined her head, precisely the correct number of degrees. Then she walked toward the side door through which she had entered. The hall was very quiet. She did not look back. The scar on his shoulder had healed clean. She knew this because she had checked it 6 weeks after the night in the forest, when a royal courier arrived in Vossheim with a letter that did not use the word request. She had read it 3 times, recognized what it actually was, an invitation, written by someone who had decided they wanted a thing and was accustomed to receiving what they decided, and spent 4 days considering her answer. Her answer had included a condition. She would serve Ironmore Keep as its physician. She would treat any person who came to her, not merely those of rank. Her medicine, her methods, her judgment on matters of health were not subject to council review. The courier returned in 2 days with a single line. Agreed. Come when you're ready. She had been ready in 3 days. She told herself this was because she wanted to establish herself before the autumn sickness season. This was partly true. The first year, she learned him the way she learned any new patient, by attention rather than by asking. She learned that he ran 3 degrees warmer than average, that the old sword injury on his left forearm ached in cold weather, and he would favor that arm for 2 days after a frost without acknowledging it, that he slept poorly when negotiations were pending, and well when he'd spent a day doing something physical. He, in turn, appeared to be learning her with equal deliberateness. He remembered she couldn't drink red wine after sundown without waking the next morning with a headache behind her left eye. He arranged, without mentioning it, that the evening meals served no red wine. He came to her workroom and sat on the low stool beside the sorting table, the stool intended for patients, and asked about her herbs with the focused attention of a man who had decided to know something and was proceeding accordingly. Why does this one grow only in limestone soil? Is it true that willow bark and this one can't be taken together? What does a fever taste like, to you, when you're deciding what it is? She answered all of them. The questions came from genuine curiosity rather than courtesy. She could distinguish between the two. And there was something in being asked about her work with that quality of attention that she hadn't known until then she had been missing. The work of the first year was not only medicine in the technical sense. Old Sir Aldous had been going blind for 2 years before she arrived, managing the progression with the particular stubbornness of a man who had built his identity on clarity of perception. He would say nothing to anyone if left to himself until he missed something critical, and the cost of his silence became a public fact. Ilara altered the lamp arrangement in the council chamber, increased the candles by 40%, began submitting written reports 3 days in advance rather than 1. She read the military maps aloud during briefings, framing it as a practice in council clarity. Aldous caught her eye once, across the table. He said nothing. She said nothing. He served another 2 years with his dignity intact. There was also Mira, 15, shifted late, existing in the keep's lower corridors in the manner of someone who had learned to make herself narrow and quiet. Ilara gave her a list of herb names and told her, matter-of-factly, that she had a strong memory and careful hands, which were the 2 most important qualities in an herbalist assistant. Within 6 weeks, Mira could identify 80 herbs by smell alone. Ilara entered none of this in the official records. These things had no official category. They were simply the work she did because she was in a position to do it, and found it difficult to be in such a position and do nothing. The second year, the wars to the north took him away for 4 months. He came back, quieter. Not in the way of grief. In the way of things compressed further into themselves by weight. He received the medicine she left outside his door each morning. He stopped coming to the workroom. In council, he began addressing her by title, the royal physician, and the effect was like being removed from a room that still contained your possessions. She continued her work. She tended the sick of Ironmore, high and low. She solved problems no one brought to her directly, by the simple method of making their solutions appear to have always existed. She wrote, in the slow hours of evenings, the first sections of a document she had been composing in her mind since before she came to Ironmore. A charter for medical practice. A framework for what it meant to care for people in a world that had not yet formalized that caring into law. She wrote a letter to her sister Philippa that she never sent. I cannot remember the last time he called me by my name. She folded it into the bottom of the cedar box their father had left her, the one with the initials carved into the lid in his own unsteady hand, the one that smelled of pine resin and something older she'd never been able to name. She made herself tea. She watched the fire. Renan Cole knocked twice before entering. He had the look of a man choosing his words, while still 20 feet from the door, and not finding satisfactory ones. He was Aldrich's first knight, which was a title that meant many things, among them, the person who said what Aldrich needed to hear, which was distinct from what Aldrich wanted to hear. Lady Va, he stopped, corrected himself.
Healer Ilara, the king asks.
He stopped again. He was looking at her workroom the way people look at a room that has been too tidily arranged. She had been here for 2 hours. She had restocked the shelves. She had updated 6 patient records. She had sorted the remaining ceremony herbs by use date and labeled them accordingly. I see, Brennan said quietly. She set down her quill. He can receive his nightly compound from Mira from tomorrow.
I've written out the instructions.
Ilara. The instructions are very clear. Brennan stood in the doorway. He was a large, difficult-to-move man in the literal sense, which was, she suspected, why Aldrich had kept him close for a decade.
Where will you go?
East of here. Ashford first. She had been thinking about this for longer than tonight. She recognized, examining the thought, that she had been thinking about it for perhaps a year. My sister Philippa is there. He'll want to speak with you. She looked at Brennan for a moment. He had the particular quality of someone who had watched 2 people closely for 3 years and understood what he was witnessing with a clarity that neither of them had quite managed. I know, she said. She packed the next afternoon, not in secret, in the straightforward, unhurried way of a person completing a piece of work they have known for some time would need completing. She did not take the items bearing the mark of her position, the blue-gray ceremonial cloak, the carved Luna brooch, the ring set with Ironmore's dark garnet. She placed the ring on the center of the examination table, precisely the way she placed tools she was returning rather than items she was leaving, and stepped back. She carried out her herb bag, which she had brought from Vossheim, and which bore her initials on the clasp in her father's hand. 3 years of medical notes in their leather cover. The cedar box with the folded letter inside. Her father's traveling cloak in undyed gray wool. Her mother's silver bracelet, plain and worn at the inside of the curve. She walked to the main gate in the afternoon light, her bag over one shoulder. The gate guards looked at her. They looked at the bag. They looked at the absence of escort. She nodded to them, the same nod she gave them every time she passed through to treat patients in the lower town, and walked through the gate. She had gone 30 feet down the road when she heard Dame Isolde's voice behind her. The way through Keldon is faster, Isolde said, from somewhere to her left. The river road takes an hour longer, but there are no patrols after Vespers. Ilara stopped. The late afternoon light lay long across the stones. She turned. Isolde was sitting on the low bench beside the kitchen garden wall, in the patch of evening sun that reached that corner for exactly 40 minutes before disappearing. She had the patient posture of a woman who had been sitting in patient postures for a very long time. How long have you known? Ilara asked. I began to suspect when you started pausing outside his chamber door in the evenings. Isolde folded her hands in her lap. Approximately 14 months ago. Ilara held this. Why didn't you say anything? I told myself it wasn't my concern. I was wrong about that. Isolde looked out at the kitchen garden, the rosemary and thyme in their winter-gray quietude, the bare canes of what would be roses in spring. Her face had the specific quality of someone examining something they have looked at so many times it has become transparent, and discovering they can finally see through it. "My husband," she said, "was the most attentive man I had ever known when I married him. He remembered everything. He asked about everything. He would sit beside me while I worked and simply want to know what I was doing." That was before he was king. Afterward, the kingdom required all of him. "And I made myself smaller and smaller to give him more room, until there was very little of me left in the shape I'd had." "I'm not you," Alara said, not unkindly. "No, you're more sensible than I was." "You're leaving before the shape goes." Isolde looked at her. "That's not a criticism." "I know." Alara adjusted the strap of her bag. "I know, Isolde." "What I'm worried about," the old woman said, "is not you. You'll be fine. You know you'll be fine." In which the kitchen garden did its silent business. "I'm worried about whether he'll understand why." Alara looked at her for a long moment. "That," she said gently, "is his work to do." She took the river road. The link between them went cold at the 3rd hour past sundown. She felt it. Not a severing, more like the dying of a fire, the moment when the last heat leaves the coals. She stopped walking, there in the dark between 2 stands of birch trees, and put her hand flat against her sternum and breathed for 3 counts. "There," she thought. "Now he knows." She adjusted her bag and continued walking. In the great hall of Ironmore, a man set down his wine cup with the deliberate care of someone whose hands might otherwise do something he'd regret. He sat at the head of 43 lords, midway through a sentence about the spring trade agreements. He finished the sentence. He picked up his cup. He kept his eyes level and his voice even, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who was, by any visible measure, fully present at a diplomatic dinner. He did this for 2 more hours. When the last lord had retired, Brennan came to stand beside him in the empty hall. "She left before sunset," Brennan said. "I know. Through the main gate." "I know." Aldrich set the cup down. The hall smelled of tallow smoke and the remnants of feast food, and the particular cold of a large stone space in which the fires are going out. She took her medical bag. And her father's cloak. And the cedar box. Nothing of ours. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. "She packed in the afternoon, not at night." "Yes, that—" He stopped. "That means something different." "Yes," Brennan said, "it does." The king's own chambers faced east, which Aldrich had never much appreciated, until mornings like this one, when the light came in too early and too honest. He had slept 2 hours. He had spent the remaining hours doing something that might be described as thinking, if thinking could be wholly unproductive, and conducted while staring at the ceiling. Brennan arrived at 7th bell and stood before the desk with his hands at his back and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone preparing to say true things. "The ring was on the examination table," Brennan said. "Centered." Something moved behind Aldrich's ribs. The center. Yes. He had given her that ring on a night in midwinter, a 1.5 years ago. He had chosen it because the stone was dark and unusual, and he had thought, this is the kind of thing she would choose for herself, if she were the sort of person who chose things for herself, without first considering what was expected. He had been, in that moment, paying attention. He had not, apparently, sustained the practice. "What are you thinking?" he said to Brennan. It was not a question. Brennan took a breath that was longer than a breath needed to be. "When the link went cold last night, you were in the middle of a sentence about the Eastern Trade Passage." "I finished the sentence." "You did." A pause. "She would have known, wherever she was, that you felt it go, and then she would have waited to see what you did." Aldrich looked at him. "And you finished the sentence," Brennan said, "and sat for 2 hours and went to bed." "I know why you did it," Brennan said.
I'm not saying you were wrong to finish the sentence, but she was feeling that same cold, alone on a road somewhere, and she already knew the answer. He paused. She walked out the main gate in broad daylight, sir. She wasn't asking you to stop her. She was telling you something. Don't send riders, Aldrich said. Brennan let out a breath that contained something that wasn't quite relief. Thank you. Tell me what I need to look at instead. Brennan nodded once. He crossed to the shelves along the eastern wall and returned with an armful of bound volumes Aldrich recognized as medical records. Start with the third one, Brennan said. The blue binding. Philippa opened the door before Alara knocked. Sisters developed a sense for this. The particular quality of footstep on a familiar path. The weight of approach. Philippa was 23, darker than Alara, with their father's eyebrows and their mother's habit of speaking her mind at the speed at which she thought it, which was faster than most people found comfortable. She looked at Alara. She looked at the bag, the gray cloak, the absence of any item she would have recognized from Ironmore. She stepped back from the door. Tea first, Philippa said, or sleep first? Sleep. Alara stepped inside. Then talk. Philippa put the kettle on, quietly, and left a cup by the door anyway. Made the way their father had made it, which was to say wrong by the technical standard, but exactly right in the way that matters, which is the way a thing tastes when you're tired and far from home. Alara sat down and looked at the cup. Something about the particular smell of that tea, the specific temperature of the room with the fire just lit, the weight of 3 years in her chest. It came forward before she could arrange a defense against it. She cried for perhaps 4 minutes with the efficiency she brought to most things. Then she dried her face, drank the tea, and slept for 12 hours without moving. She had 3 years of broad medical experience, an understanding of politics she had absorbed the way you absorb rain. Her name, Voss, not Vane. Her name as it had always been. And enough money for the winter. She had been enough before. She would be enough again. Brother Aldwin arrived on her 3rd day in Ashford, in the manner of all unexpected patients, at an inconvenient hour, apologetic and urgent at once. He had a child with him, 8 years old, who had been burning with fever for 9 days and had been seen by 3 physicians and had improved in none of the ways 3 physicians had suggested she should improve. Alara crouched to the child's level. She watched the girl breathe. She asked the mother 4 questions. She asked about the well the family drew their water from. The east well, the mother said. Stop using it. Use the west well until I say otherwise. Alara stood and reached into her bag. This preparation, twice daily. I'll write it out. The child's fever broke on the 5th day. Aldwin was back by the 6th, not with a patient, but with the expression of a man who has realized something and wants to speak it aloud to make it real. I told everyone, he said simply. By the end of the month, she had more patients than hours, and people were calling her Healer Voss in the market, with the ease of a name that had always existed. She noticed, each time, the way it sat in the air. Voss. Not the royal physician, not Lady Vane. Her own name, in her own right, landing in the world with no other weight attached to it. She had forgotten, slightly, what that felt like. He arrived without a herald, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he sat down without being invited, and showed no sign of finding this irregular, which suggested either poor manners or the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent long enough in important rooms to have forgotten they required an invitation. He waited through the entirety of her treatment of a blacksmith's hand, a deep cut from a misdirected chisel, not serious, but requiring care, without speaking, without sighing, without the fidgeting of impatience. He simply observed. His eyes were the color of winter fog, and they moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to gathering information in public places without appearing to. When the blacksmith left, he said, Lord Cassian Gray, envoy of the White Moon Conclave. I know who you are. She was cleaning her instruments. I saw you at Ironmore. You noticed me. I notice everyone. She set the cloth down and looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 32, with the weathered look of someone who traveled more than he stayed, and the quality of stillness in him was genuine rather than performed. What do you want? To offer you something. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. I spent 2 months tracing the work done in Ironmore under your name. Which is to say, under your initials, since your name doesn't appear in the official records. Alara was quiet. 14 diplomatic resolutions. A complete restructuring of the palace medical system. The reason Sir Aldous was able to serve 3 years beyond what his condition should have allowed. None of it attributed. He paused. The conclave needs a medical advisor. Independent. Beholden to no pack, no lord, no king. And you've decided I'm suited to it. I've decided no one else currently practicing is remotely qualified. He said it without embellishment, which was, she found, more convincing than if he'd said it warmly. There's an unfinished charter in Ironmore, medical rights, standardized practice, legal protection for independent healers. I'd like to see it finished. Alara set down the scissors. The conclave will have objections to my situation. I've addressed those. She looked at him. Before coming to ask me. I don't make offers I'm not certain I can keep. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, more the acknowledgement of one. Any person worth asking deserves an offer with substance behind it. Alara studied him for a moment, read his breathing, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested rather than gripped. He means it. He's calculated for it. He came here alone. Give me a week, she said. Philippa appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds after Cassian Gray's horse had rounded the corner at the end of the road. That man, she said, looks at you the way, the way someone looks when they actually see a person. Alara was tidying the examination table. Her hands were very busy. I need a week to think. You've already decided. I need a week to be certain I've decided for the right reasons. Philippa came into the room and sat down on the stool. She remained present. She said nothing. After a while, Alara said, He's the first person in 4 years who asked for my work and knew what my work was. I know. That's not sufficient reason to... It's not what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. Philippa was very serene. I'm listening. Alara sat down across from her. It's a good position. The charter needs to be finished. The conclave is the right place for it. All of that's true. And Cassian Gray is... She stopped. A competent professional with an honest manner and a clear purpose. And his seeing me clearly is relevant to the work, not to anything else. Absolutely, said Philippa, in a tone that meant the opposite of nothing. Alara looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she stood and went back to her instruments. I'm taking the position, she said. He read all of them, the medical records, the patient logs, the note system she had built along the back wall of the workroom, not the wall that faced the door, where any visitor would see it, but the interior wall, the one that would only be noticed by someone who had come to use the room for its actual purpose. He read it with the deliberate attention of a man completing an accounting he had failed to start sooner. By the 3rd day, he was sitting on the low stool beside the sorting table, the stool intended for patients. He found the notation about Aldous in the 2nd volume. He read it twice, sat with it, and thought about every council session of the past 2 years. The lamp arrangements he had never questioned, the early reports he had assumed were administrative quirk, the way Aldous had always managed. He thought about the fact that he had not noticed the management. He found the reconciliation log, 14 entries, each dated, each recording the names of parties and the nature of the dispute, and, at the end, a single line describing what the dispute had actually been about beneath its surface. He recognized every situation.
He had attended the aftermath of every resolution, accepting the result as a natural outcome of circumstances. EV. Each entry read at the bottom. EV. 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 He went to Isolde. She received him in the solar with the patience of someone who had been expecting this visit for some time. She listened while he told her what he had found. Then she told him about her husband. Plainly, in the way of someone reporting a fact they have spent a long time understanding. The king who had loved her, who had become gradually occupied by the large requirements of his position, who had not noticed the small and incremental disappearance of the person closest to him.
She didn't disappear, Aldrich said.
No, she's cleverer than I was. Isolde set down her cup. She kept herself.
She left before she couldn't.
She walked out the front gate, he said. Yes, that was a message, Aldrich. The question is whether you can read it. On the fourth day, he called for Father Anselm and dictated a document, read before the full conclave session in Alara's absence. It stated that Alara Voss retained all honors and protections of her position, that she owed Ironmore no obligation, that any agreement she entered in her own name was legally sound and required no ratification from him or from Ironmore's council. Brennan heard the text afterward and said nothing for a long moment. "You've set her entirely free," he said. "She was already free. I put the seal on it." Lady Vane Ashcroft left Ironmore the following week, quietly, without drama. She sent no word of farewell. Neither did he. Some things ended simply because they had never truly begun. The letter Alara sent was not to Aldrich. She wrote it to Dame Isolde, because Isolde had stood at a kitchen garden gate in the late afternoon and told her the truth without being asked to, which was, in Alara's accounting, among the more significant gifts one person could offer another. The letter was brief. She had accepted the position with the White Moon Conclave. She was well. She was writing the charter under her own name, in the evenings, after the patients had gone. She hoped the herb garden was being properly managed. There was a specific sequence for cutting the thyme in late season that she had written on the back of a blue card, which could be found in the third drawer of the workroom cabinet. 2 sentences at the end, added after she had already sealed and then reopened the letter. "I hope the keep is well. I hope the people I cared for are being cared for." She did not write his name. She knew, as she pressed the wax seal down with her thumb, that this absence was louder than anything she could have written instead. Isolde placed the letter on Aldrich's desk without comment and left the room. He read it standing up, which was how he read things he did not want to be seen reading. Less committed, less visible. He read it again. He read it a third time, more slowly, and stopped at the 2 sentences at the end. "I hope the keep is well. I hope the people I cared for are being cared for." Not, "I hope you are well." Not his name, not even its shadow. The people she had cared for. As though he were among them, counted but unnamed, placed in a category rather than singled out. He set the letter down, picked it up again, stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard, where 2 stable boys were arguing cheerfully about something involving a bucket, and the argument seemed very loud and very far away at once. He spent 3 evenings writing replies and burning them. The 4th evening he called Brennan in. "I need you to tell me," Aldrich said, "whether the change I am attempting is visible from the outside, or whether it only exists in my own accounting." Brennan sat down, unusual, he generally stood, and was quiet for a moment. "3 weeks ago you asked the kitchen to keep a written record of which ingredients came from which supplier, because one of the cooks mentioned she'd been having headaches, and you thought it might be the southern grain. You noticed, you asked, you followed through." Brennan looked at him steadily. "That's different from who you were 6 months ago." "That's a very small thing." "Most things are small," Brennan said. "That's what she's been telling you this entire time." Aldrich looked at his desk, at the letter, which he had not put away. "Write her," Brennan said. "Not a long letter, not a case for yourself, just Write her. The letter Aldrich sent 3 days later was 4 lines long. I am not asking you to return. I am not asking you to forgive anything. I am asking whether you would be willing to meet me, once, at a place and time of your choosing, with whatever conditions you require. I have things I should have said a long time ago. Aldrich. Not the Alpha King of Ironmore, not his title, only his name, plain and without armor, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had put on paper in years. A merchant passing through Ashford mentioned, over dinner at Marta's Inn, that Lord Cassian Gray of the White Moon Conclave had been seen twice in the past month, riding the road toward the Voss household. This piece of information traveled, as all pieces of information eventually traveled, toward Ironmore. It arrived at Aldrich's breakfast table on a Tuesday, carried inside a routine trader's report that Brennan set before him without particular emphasis. Aldrich read it, set it aside, picked up his cup, set the cup down. Brennan, across the table, said nothing, and was entirely too carefully occupied with his own documents. He came alone, Aldrich said, after a moment that had lasted longer than it appeared. To Ashford. Apparently. Both times. So the report says. Aldrich looked at the document again. The words had not changed. Lord Cassian Gray, twice. The road to Ashford. The Voss household. Very simple words. He found them considerably more difficult to read than their simplicity should have allowed. That evening, 4 drafts of a letter were committed to the fire. The 5th draft was the one he sent. Through Isolde, not through official couriers, because official couriers implied official business, and this was not that. The letter Ilara received was 4 lines. She read it once, folded it, and placed it on the sorting table beside her herb jars. She left it there for 5 days. Philippa, on the 3rd day. You're still keeping it where you can see it. I work at that table. You work at the writing desk too. You haven't moved it there. Ilara sorted a handful of chamomile into its jar. The small yellow heads caught the window light and smelled of summer, even in autumn. I haven't decided. You've read it once. I know what it says. That's not what I mean. Philippa picked up an empty jar and turned it in her hands. The people who read letters many times are usually trying to find something they missed. You only read it once because you understood it immediately, and now you're deciding whether that understanding is enough. Ilara looked at her sister. When did you become perceptive about other people's correspondence? I've always been perceptive. You've always been too busy to notice. Ilara wrote to Brennan, not to Aldrich. She wrote, Is the change real, or is this the behavior of a man who is frightened of what he's lost and wants to recover it without understanding why it went? Brennan's reply came 6 days later, and it was the longest letter he had ever written. It described, without sentiment and without editorializing, what Aldrich had done in the 2 months since she had left. The stool beside the sorting table, the lamp records, the 14 entries read and reread, the document sent to the conclave declaring her free, the cook with the headaches. The last paragraph read, I have served him for 10 years. I have never seen him dismantle himself on purpose. He is doing it now. Whether that is sufficient is a question I cannot answer for you. But I wanted you to know it is not performance. I have watched enough performances to know the difference. Ilara read this letter 3 times. Then she wrote back to Aldrich. 2 sentences. The forest where we first met. 1 week from today, at midday. She sealed it before she could reconsider, handed it to Philippa to post before she could unseal it. Well, Philippa said at the door. Don't, Ilara said. Philippa went to post the letter and said nothing further. The child who came to fetch her arrived at a run. He came to Marta's Inn, where Ilara was finishing the last of her evening case notes, and he said it in the breathless fragments of someone who had been running and hadn't bothered to sort the information into order. There's someone hurt bad at the border watch post. They want a healer, the closest one. She had the bag over her shoulder before he finished. The watch post was a rough timber structure at the forest's edge. Someone had lit a lamp inside. She pushed the door open. A man on a rough-hewn table. Sword injury, left side. The cloth of his shirt darkened. Soldiers in patrol gear, tense with the specific tension of people waiting for someone else to know what to do. And in the corner, a large, dark-haired man in traveling clothes rather than a uniform. Watching her with eyes she recognized, even in the poor light, before she had resolved the rest of his face. Brennan Cole. Who should not be at an eastern border watch post unless... She looked at the man on the table. He had turned his head toward the door at the sound of it opening. The lamp caught his face. She crossed to the table. She looked at the wound, which was what she was there for. Sword. Clean entry, left side. Deep enough to require immediate attention, shallow enough to be survivable. She pulled on her working gloves. "Lie still," she said. "Ilara." His voice. The particular texture of it. She had not heard it in 4 months, and had apparently not made sufficient provisions against what that would do in a small lamplit room. "Lie still," she said again, and began to work. She worked methodically. Water heated on the small camp stove. The specific pressure of someone who has learned that pain managed well is less damaging than pain managed poorly. His breathing was controlled. She could see him choosing to make it controlled. She moved to the suturing. This required her to bring her work close, to brace with her left hand while her right moved, to keep her face near enough to see clearly in the imperfect light. His chest rose and fell with careful breath beneath her hands. She tied off the final suture. The bandaging required her to pass cloth behind him and lean across, her shoulder over his chest, her hair falling forward. The edge of it touched his shoulder. Neither of them moved. "Sorry," she said, against what remained of the silence between them. "Don't." Barely sound, meant for her alone. She straightened and continued her work. She prepared the feverwort compound, the smell of it filling the tent, familiar, the smell of her workroom in Ironmore on winter evenings. "Drink this. It's bitter." He drank it, watching her through the whole of it. "You're still here," he said. She tightened the last loop of bandage. "I haven't been anywhere else. I've been in Ashford." "You're the one who was on a border patrol." "I wasn't supposed to be in this particular spot." "No one is ever supposed to be in this particular spot." She began to repack her kit. "I'll stay through the night. Fever may set in around the 3rd hour. Because I'm a patient." She looked at him for the first time since she'd begun working. Directly. Fully. He looked different from 4 months ago. The lines of his face had shifted in a way she recognized from her work. The way a person's face changed when they had been carrying something heavy and had finally, recently, set it down. It did not make him look lighter. It made him look more like himself. "Because you're a patient," she said, "and this is my work." Around the 3rd hour past midnight, the fever came. She was beside him before it crested, the cloth already damp. He murmured something. She leaned closer. "Ilara." A pause, in the unfocused way of the barely conscious. Ilara Voss. Her name, her full name, the one that had been replaced, in the official language of Ironmore, by a title. Something moved in her chest, carefully, like something testing whether it was safe to move. The cold that had been there for 4 months was not gone. But it was less cold. A specific fraction less cold. She pressed the cloth to his forehead and kept her hand there, resting lightly against his temple, for longer than the temperature check required. His breathing steadied beneath her palm. Outside. The forest, the dark, the turning of the night toward morning. He woke to gray light and the smell of willow bark tea. She was at the camp table, her back to him, her hands moving with the compact efficiency she brought to every physical task. Her hair was down. She was wearing the gray cloak he recognized, the one that belonged to No House. She turned, bringing the tea,
sat down on the low stool and checked his forehead with the back of her hand. Clinical and exact. No fever, the bandaging held. You can't ride for 5 days. She folded her hands in her lap. Your men can escort you to the road, and I'll make sure you have enough compound to… Alara. She stopped. I read the reconciliation log, he said. Silence. Not the silence of surprise, she was rarely surprised, but the silence of someone deciding how to receive information they had not anticipated needing to receive. All 14 entries, he said. The one about Harwin and Rael. The one about the trade negotiations that everyone thought collapsed naturally. The one about the Sunfield family and the poisoned well that you solved in 2 days and attributed to weather in the written report. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether a patient was being honest or being what they thought she wanted. I also read the lamp adjustment records for the council chamber and the report submission schedule changes. He paused. I know about Aldous. Something shifted in her face. Not breaking, not relief exactly, more the particular quality of a held thing being allowed to set down. I didn't see it, he said. I sat in that chamber for 2 years, and I didn't see what you were doing. I want you to understand that this is the thing I am most… He stopped, chose the word deliberately. Ashamed of. Not the ceremony, not any of it. The fact that you built something intricate and true and generous in a room I walked through every day, and I didn't see it. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the early birds had started. Sparrows in the underbrush, testing the new day. I called you the royal physician in council, he said. Yes. I did it. I told myself I did it because I was protecting you. If I showed how much weight you carried with me, politically, I know why you did it. Her voice was even. I understood the logic at the time. The logic was sound. The logic was wrong. They're different things. Yes, he said. They are. She stood and went to the camp table and came back with the tea, set it beside him, placed it within reach, which he recognized as the specific language of someone who is not yet ready to close distance, but is not building further either. What I needed, she said, sitting back down, was not different treatment. I needed to be seen doing what I was doing, by the person I was doing it beside. Not celebrated, not announced. Just seen. I know. You can know it now. I need to understand the difference between knowing it now and having learned it. He held this. What would convince you they're the same? He said. She looked at him. Time. Different choices, made over time, in the directions opposite to the ones that led here. And I need to be able to continue being what I'm building in Ashford. The charter. That's mine. The conclave position? That's mine. Any return to anything is beside those, not instead of them. I know. I need you to know it at a deeper level than agreement. What does deeper look like? She was quiet for a moment. Not the considering her words quiet, but the considering whether to say it quiet, which was rarer from her. In that forest, she said, 3 years ago, you asked me my name before you told me yours. He waited. That version of you asked the right question first. Her voice was careful, even. I need to understand whether that person is still present, or whether he's been buried so long under the weight of Ironmore that you'd need to excavate him. He looked at the dawn light coming through the oilskin window, gray and gradual, the specific quality of light that doesn't announce itself. I asked you right hand or left, he said, and I fell in love with you before you looked up from your work. I've been trying to protect that at the same time I was destroying it. I know those things are both true. I don't have a defense for the second one. Ilara set her folded hands on her knee. In the tense small light, he could see the angles of her face, the clean lines of it, unchanged, and beneath them, something he recognized as the quality she'd always had. She was looking at him clearly. She was seeing him. 1 week from now, she said. Come to Marta's Inn in Ashford. Come on a plain horse, and don't bring more than one companion. We'll talk more, in an ordinary room, without the emergency. And after that? 1 week, she said. Heal your side. Don't ride. The ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. Understood. She began packing her kit. He watched her hands, the economical, exact movements, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that watching her hands was something he had always done, had always been the thing he did when he didn't want her to see what was in his face. She, he suspected, had always known. He arrived at Marta's Inn on a plain horse with Brennan, who tied the horses outside and announced he was going to have a drink at the bar and would not hear anything through the wall. They sat at a table sufficiently scarred and practical to resist any interpretation as romantic. Aldrich sat across from her and did something she had not seen him do in 2 years. He waited, without directing the silence, and let her begin. She told him about the ceremony with the candles, the wrong color, replaced before dawn, and then about every ceremony before it, the 100 small acts of management that had constituted her presence at Ironmore, in the way an underground river constitutes a landscape, entirely, invisibly. She told it without accusation, like a medical history, the record of a condition that had been developing for longer than either of them had named it. When she finished, I have a proposal, and it's not the kind where you tell me it's a good idea before you've thought about it. He waited. I keep Ashford. I keep the conclave position. The charter comes with me wherever I am. When I'm at Ironmore, if I'm at Ironmore, I'm there because I choose to be, for the time I choose to be, on terms that are mine. She paused. What I'm not doing is returning to a role that made me into a function. That's not flexible. I know. The last time I said something like that, you agreed without thinking. This time, I've thought about it for 4 months. He met her eyes. The room you worked in is called Voss Room now. Father Anselm changed the records. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't ask for that. I know you didn't. He wrapped his hands around his cup, the self-containing gesture of a large man trying not to use too much space. That's why I did it. They met 6 more times over the following 3 months, always in Ashford. The soft moments accumulated the way soft things accumulate, gradually, in the periphery, becoming undeniable only in retrospect. The afternoon she was delayed by a complicated birth, and he waited 40 minutes in the market rain and said nothing about the waiting when she arrived. Only called for hot tea because her hands were cold, and she hadn't noticed. She looked at the tea. She looked at him. The lesson about the Latin order of herb names, in which she stood at the shelf and he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without turning around. There, she said, placing a jar, between Artemisia and Botanica. I see it. Alphabetical order. Yes. He reached past her, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone aware of every centimeter, to place the next jar. Like this? Like that. Neither of them moved for one breath. Next one, she said. He handed her the jar. Their fingers met at the transfer, the specific, entirely ordinary contact of an exchange. And she did not look up, and he did not step back, and the exchange lasted a fraction of a second longer than exchanges usually did. The jar went on the shelf. They continued alphabetically. Neither of them remarked on anything. Late in the 3rd month, she told him about the letter she had written to Philippa and never sent. The cedar box. The sentence that had become a kind of internal refrain. I cannot remember the last time he called me by my name. I found it when I unpacked at Philippa's, still folded exactly as I had left it. Did you read it? I didn't need to. I remembered what it said. Aldrich was quiet. What did you do with it? I left it there, in the box. A pause. It happened. It's true. I'm not in the habit of destroying true things. He nodded once, the nod of someone receiving information given carefully and intending to treat it accordingly. I called you Alara Voss, he said. In the tent, when I was fevered? I know. I didn't know I was doing it. That, she said, is exactly why it meant something. She had been building it in her mind since the first year at Ironmore. The Charter of Medical Practice was 12 pages in its final form, dense, specific, addressed to the question of what it meant to care for people in a world that recognized caring as necessary, but hadn't yet decided it deserved protection. It covered the right of practice across territorial lines, standards of training, the legal standing of a healer's testimony, the protection of patient information from political use. It was the most honest document she had ever written. She stood before the conclave and presented it in full, 40 minutes, with the particular quality she brought to all formal occasions: complete, precise, allowing no gap for the wrong kind of interruption. 3 lords raised objections about her standing. She answered each one. Cassian Gray, from his seat at the council table, answered one of them before she did, briefly and without flourish, in the way of someone who has already considered all the angles and settled on the clearest route through. She appreciated his efficiency, in the same way she appreciated a well-made instrument, for what it was, for what it could do, without confusion about what it was for. The 4th objection came from Lord Harmont of the North. The Lady Vane should not be presenting legislative material independently. Healer Voss. She knew the voice. She did not look toward it. She looked at Lord Harmont, who had turned toward the back of the chamber where Aldrich had risen, unhurriedly, from the observer's bench. Healer Voss, Aldrich said again, is presenting legislative material as conclave medical advisor, a position the conclave appointed her to, and which does not require her husband's endorsement or my attendance. He paused. I'm here as an observer, nothing more. Harmon opened his mouth. However, Aldrich's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It simply continued with the same level certainty. If the question is whether I endorse this charter, I do. Not because I have the right to endorse it on her behalf, but because I sat in a keep for 3 years while this work was being built in the room beside mine, and failed to understand what I was witnessing. A pause. Anyone who doubts the substance of this document is welcome to challenge it on its merits. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Alara looked at him across the room. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Harmon, calmly, in the way of a man who has said what he came to say and requires no performance of its effect. It was the first time he had used his authority for her, not to protect himself, not for politics. Simply because it was right. Simply because she was right. She looked back at the conclave. The vote, she said. The charter passed by 7-4. Cassian Gray voted first, set his quill down and looked across at her with the expression of someone who has known the outcome for some time and is satisfied, finally, to see it arrive. After the session, Cassian crossed to where Alara was gathering her papers. Congratulations, he said. Thank you. For the conclave. She paused. For seeing it. He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't difficult to see. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Aldrich had been sitting, now empty, then back at her. He's different from what I expected. He's working at it, she said. Cassian nodded once, with the economy of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with his decision. I'll see you at the winter session, Healer Voss. He left without ceremony, which was, she had always thought, his best quality. The return was quiet, not permanent, not complete in the way of a thing resolved, more like a tide coming in, which knows nothing of resolution, only of its own returning. She kept the house in Ashford. She kept the conclave position. She arrived at Ironmore in the 2nd week of summer, with her herb bag over one shoulder and a satchel of charter revisions under one arm, and walked through the main gate in the afternoon light. And the light was the same as when she'd left, and it was entirely different. Mira was waiting at the door of the workroom. Alara looked at her. The girl who had been 15 and narrow with self-erasure, now 17,
and standing with her hands at her sides in the posture of someone who has located her own edges and decided they are, in fact, where she begins and ends. She had Alara's classification system on a board beside the door, updated in her own hand with 3 additions.
You changed the fever ward entry, Alara said.
I found a secondary use. I documented it. Mira hesitated. Is that? Show me the notes.
It was correct. It was, moreover, careful. The kind of cautious, honest documentation that took more time than the shortcut and was worth it.
Alara read it twice. Good, she said. Add it to the official record under your name. Mira's face did something complicated and controlled, and Alara recognized the control for what it was, having practiced it herself. She found Isolde in the kitchen garden that same afternoon. The same bench beside the garden wall, the same patch of sun, as though the old woman had never moved in the months between. You look different, Isolde said. Better? Alara asked. Complete. Like someone who has finished running and chosen to stand still. Not stood still because she had no strength left. Alara sat down on the bench beside her. The kitchen garden smelled of rosemary and turned earth, the same as it always had.
The bare canes she had seen in winter were roses now, small and yellow and entirely confident of themselves.
I owe you a debt, Alara said. You owe me nothing. The road directions, the honesty about your husband. The willingness to admit you'd been wrong to stay silent. That last one was the most useful. Isolde was quiet for a moment. Then, is he doing the work? Yes. Is it the right kind of work? Not the work of a man who wants to recover what he lost, but the work of a man who understands what he was. Alara considered this carefully. Yes, she said again more slowly. I believe it is. Isolde nodded once, with the finality of someone closing an account they have been keeping for a long time. Good, she said. That's all I needed to know. They sat together in the afternoon sun and said nothing further, because nothing further was required. On her 3rd morning back, she was in the kitchen garden before the household woke, the best time for harvesting, the dew still on the stems.
She had her basket and her shears.
She heard footsteps on the stone path, not Mira's step. He came around the corner of the wall with a cup in each hand and the expression of a man who has prepared something and is attempting not to appear as though he has prepared something. He set one cup beside her basket without a word and lowered himself onto the garden wall.
He did not speak. She did not speak.
She continued harvesting, the rosemary first, then the hyssop, and he sat in the early light and did not perform his presence. After a while, she reached for the cup without pausing in her work, and drank. You steeped the sage twice, she said. I wasn't sure of the time. I can taste the bitterness. She moved to the next row. 4 minutes, no more. I'll remember. Aldrich. The hyssop is in the wrong bed. It's been planted beside the rue. Is that a problem? They compete for the same minerals. They shouldn't touch. She sat back on her heels. Someone made that decision while I was gone. Mira thought it looked better together. Mira is wrong about the botany and right that they look well together. I'll move them, but I'll tell her why. He was looking at her with that look, the look that was not admiration in the decorative sense, but attention in the true sense, the look of someone who finds a person genuinely interesting and is not in the habit of hiding it. She set her shears down, turned on the garden path until she was facing him. The morning garden was quiet around them. Somewhere above the kitchen wall, swifts were beginning their first circuit. The smell of rosemary on her hands, and the warm stone of the wall, and the cup with its twice-steeped sage. She crossed the distance between them and sat beside him on the wall. Close, not touching, in the way of 2 people who have learned to allow themselves to be near each other without requiring it to mean something it hasn't yet been asked to mean. He didn't move. She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she rested her head against his shoulder. His breath changed, not in the dramatic way, in the quiet way, the catching and releasing that meant something had been held and was now less held. He lifted his hand and placed it over hers where it rested on the wall between them. Slowly, the way you move when you are not certain of permission and are treating the uncertainty with respect. "I love you," he said, not loudly, not with the weight of a statement requiring response. It had the quality of something finally put down after being carried for too long. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the rosemary beds. "I know," she said. "That's not always sufficient." "I know. It's a beginning." "I know." His hand didn't tighten, remained what it was, present, still, allowing her to be exactly where she was. "That's enough. For now." The Swifts finished their first circuit and began their second. The garden went on with the unhurried industry of growing things that have no particular investment in what the people among them do, only in the light and the rain and the minerals in the appropriate beds. She stayed where she was. The Voss room was called the Voss room now on all official documents, which Father Anselm had updated with the particular pleasure of a man who considers accurate record-keeping a form of justice. Mira was sorting the winter herb stock when Alara arrived, sorting it in the correct order, which Alara had taught her, with 2 additions of her own that improved on the original system, in a way Alara had acknowledged in writing and in the official record under Mira's name. Sir Aldous was at the small reading table, a document before him, printed in the larger type that was now the conclave standard for all advisory reports, which had been written into the Charter under Section 7, Access to Information. He no longer pretended to read documents he couldn't see clearly. He simply requested the larger type, which was now available because it was written into law, which was in the Charter, which had been built in this room. These things connected in ways that were visible only if you looked at them in the right order. Alara sat at her desk. She opened the current draft, the 3rd revision of the Charter, incorporating the first year's practical experience, and began to write. She was 3 pages in when the door opened. He had learned over a year to open doors quietly, not because she had asked, but because he had noticed, the way she'd watched him notice things since the beginning, accurately, without announcement. He set the cup beside her hand in the way of something practiced. She drank from it without looking up. "Right temperature," she said. "I had guidance. Don't be smug about it." "I'm not being smug. I'm noting the role of good teaching in achieving competence." She looked up at that, the corner of his mouth, which was doing the thing it did, the thing she had decided she did not find disarming and continued to find disarming at intervals. He had sat down across from her, opened a document of his own, and appeared to be working. They worked. The room was quiet in the way of shared work. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of 2 people in the same space, who have learned that presence does not require constant demonstration. Mira moved between shelves. Aldous turned a page. The light from the window shifted as the morning clouds reorganized themselves over Ironmore. After a while, Alara looked up. "You have the conclave report before this afternoon's council," she said. "I know." "Read the section on Aldous first. The seating arrangement for the spring session matters. Harmon and the Eastern delegation shouldn't share the north wall." He looked at her for a moment. "You've already arranged it." "I've noted it. You need to read the note and make the decision." "Ilara." She waited. "You do that," he said. "You notice the things no one else notices, and you arrange what they would not think to arrange. That's not your job title. That's the way you exist in a room." "I'm not saying that as something I'm taking credit for seeing. I'm saying it so that you hear it said." She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. In the morning light, his eyes were the dark gray she had first seen in a forest clearing at dusk. River stones in deep water, the color of a sky before it decides what the day will be. And sometimes, when the light caught them at the right angle, there was a warmth there, a low amber glow like coal alight. The bond they had built and rebuilt and chosen repeatedly in the ordinary moments of ordinary days. She looked back at the charter. "Read the note," she said. "Reading the note," he said.
Mira, at the far shelf, studied a jar of dried chamomile with great interest.
Aldous turned another page. Outside, the sound of Ironmore waking. Carts, voices, the particular percussion of a keep in its daily business, indifferent to small moments conducted in warm rooms at morning. The link between them was warm. It was the warmth of something that had been cold and was now, carefully, something else. Not the same thing it had been in the forest clearing, not the uncomplicated warmth of first recognition. Different, more particular. The warmth of something that had been tested and had survived, and had been chosen afterward, deliberately, in the knowledge of its own imperfection. Some bonds, the old song said, were forged by the goddess of the moon in a single moment, strong, certain, immovable. Some were made in 4-minute steepings and incorrect herb arrangements, and the specific, ordinary silence of two people working in the same room on separate things, choosing, each morning, to return. Both kinds lasted. The second kind perhaps meant more, because it could not be attributed to anything but choice. The choosing, someone would write later in the annals of Ironmore, is the bond itself, not the finding.
The continuing. Elara Voss continued. Aldrich Vane continued. Outside, Ironmore continued, as it always had, as it would. Loud with its ordinary business, indifferent to small acts of devotion conducted in warm rooms, unaware that such acts were, in fact, the architecture of something lasting. The charter revision was done by noon. The chamomile was correctly shelved. Aldous got the seating arrangements in writing. It was, on all accounts, an ordinary morning. Some bonds are forged in a single moment, by moonlight and fate, and things larger than either person. The strongest ones are chosen again and again, in bitter tea and alphabetical order, and the silence of 30 minutes in a herb garden at dawn. In the willingness to remain, in the choosing.